All right, this lecture we are going to continue to talk about the world of manufacturing. This lecture, here are some of the objectives behind what we're trying to go through. We want to identify some major developments in the history of manufacturing, describe how manufacturing impacts people and the economy, explain how customer expectations affect manufacturers, describe the effects of global economy on manufacturers, and explain how regulations and standards also affect manufacturers. So we're going to start out here with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and talk a little bit about actual human needs. So on the lowest level here of the pyramid, so if we're talking about Maslow, that is the basic needs for physical survival. So those include food, water, livable environment, clothing, and shelter. Once all of those needs are met and sustained, we can kind of move up the pyramid into safety, protection, and security. So once we have all of our basic needs met, then we need to be able to feel like we're safe from harm from family members, strangers, or occupational hazards. Continuing to move up from there, then we get into the idea of belongingness and love. So membership in the family and your community groups. So we want love from family, friends, and significant others. Continuing to move up the hierarchy of needs pyramid, after we have achieved everything below that, then we can talk about esteem, self-esteem, respect from others, status, public recognition, respect, of course, for oneself, a sense of competence and confidence, and eventually we get up to the very top of the pyramid with what's called self-actualization. So, and the reach for full potential as we continue through our lives. Now, manufacturing has a role, especially in kind of meeting basic needs, so, and developing safety, protection and security, and even giving people a sense of belonging and love. So belongingness especially, and then of course through that we can certainly have esteem in the job that we do, and in the idea of having confidence and being competent in the job that we do there as well. So let's start here with talking about the basic human needs. Of course, we need air to breathe. We need to have water so that we can drink, food, shelter, and clothing. And manufacturing helps with all of these and helps us to meet these basic human needs. So if you think about it, prior to the Industrial Revolution, so we're going to go back to before the Industrial Revolution. Now, depending on the historical context, the Industrial Revolution started sometime in the mid to late 1700s, kind of continued right on through into the early 1900s, of a period of about 150 some years. Maybe some historians might even spread it out to 200 years there. So if you go back, say, to the 1700s, early 1800s, Decatur as a town, I think, was settled sometime and became a town sometime in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So let's think about what and how those needs were met at that time. So, and that's kind of where we're going to be talking about. Certainly, Decatur as a whole was a prairie at that point. And people coming across from the East Coast as they tried to settle Illinois, so we settled here in Decatur because Decatur had a good source of water. Water source was, of course, through the Sangamon River. And that provided a good source for water to meet human needs. Of course, the prairie provided the ability to hunt for food. So, we had plenty of deer, wild game, other stuff in this area to hunt for and get food. And then, of course, the soil content here in central Illinois was very, very rich and allowed for us to grow food there as well. So, at that point, we also kind of start to think about building shelter. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the building materials were in terms of the shelter that was built at that time here in central Illinois. All right, so going to the Industrial Revolution, started in the late 1700s. We talk about who the world superpowers are. Now, at that point, England was definitely the world superpower. Other European countries like France, Germany, Spain were still somewhat of a power, although Spain had kind of fallen a little bit and wasn't quite as much of a superpower as they were in the 1600s. But those were important areas in the country, or in the world, basically, especially England. So, and those economies were supported. So we're going to talk a little bit about what made those economies so great and what was it that provided those European countries with their superpower. We'll also talk a little bit about how things were made at that point in time. So as the mid-1800s started to come around, society started to change. So during the Industrial Revolution and before that, most of society was what we call an agrarian society. It was still kind of settled around our ability to plant and grow and harvest. So you did have basically a lot more in terms of farmers. Cities were starting to develop and were fairly big, but they were also kind of limited in growth due to the ability to have plants and crops to be able to feed the masses, more or less, in the society. But we did start to change during this time period to become more of a manufacturing economy as a whole. So as we talk about this, so we need to think a little bit about what were some of the power sources to meet needs before the Industrial Revolution. So certainly we needed light, and most of the light either was coming from the sunlight, or we had candles, of course, candles that were made from wax or different types of fuel oils like whale oil. So we could provide heat through lumber and timber or burning coal. What about mechanization and transportation? So we were still kind of limited at that point. And if you think about it, prior to the Industrial Revolution, in order to go anywhere, you were either walking, or you had some type of a horse or animal to kind of help transport you. Either were riding your horse, or you would use a horse and buggy or some type of a oxen to kind of drive that train and bring you over. So everything that was built prior to this Industrial Revolution was pretty much all sustained by the craftspeople and the gilded trades. So you did specialize. You would be apprenticed, depending on whether you wanted to be a cooper, or a metalsmith, or a tinsmith, or a blacksmith. So smithing was a very, very popular term and a type of gilded trade that became there. Of course, you still had carpentry, and all of these were done through the trades, where you learned your craft. It was a artisan, very craft-oriented type society, where everything was custom, handmade, built kind of one at a time. We didn't really have what we refer to as modern mechanization and mass production at that point. Everything took a long time to build and make, even sewing. So, in order to get the fabrics, so we would have homemade looms that would kind of weave that fabric and weave the textiles that we needed to place in our home. So the only way you really afforded and were able to get commercial goods was if you had a lot of income and a lot of money, if you were wealthy and you had the ability to pay for those things. Otherwise, it was very, very labor intensive to manufacture and make anything at this time period. So during the Industrial Revolution, we had several inventions that came along that started to spur the Industrial Revolution. We had the Watt steam engine, the power loom, cotton gin, gas street lighting became big, so we started the electromagnet, first photograph, Stephenson's rocket, the electrical telegraph, the steam hammer, and then, of course, mass steel production. All of these things were developed and came about. These inventions helped to spur and drive the Industrial Revolution. So before, everything was handmade. Now, because of some of this innovation and invention, we were starting to change over to where products, goods, and were made by machine as opposed to being handmade. So we'll talk about the importance of some of these inventions. So all of these inventions impacted our ability for transportation, clothing, construction, and food. So this was very, very important to our ability to start to manufacture goods. So if you can think about it, so probably the one invention that became very, very important to so many different areas was the steam engine. So the steam engine made it possible, of course, for the development of the railroads and the railroad industry. So whereas before you had wagons or carts that would be pulled by animals, you had the development of the steam engine, which led to the locomotive and trains, and the transportation industry was revolutionized by that. At the same time, steam engines were able to start to power factories. So, and we were able to basically, prior to this, we might have needed water as a power source, or, through the use of the water wheel. So, or we might have had the use of windmills in some areas of the world that provided a power source for this. But in this case, we could build a steam engine. So long as we had some water, we could generate steam, and that steam could give us power to drive gears and pulleys and shafts, where we could actually start to build factories at other places besides just along rivers, where we would need to harness the power of water in order to build those. So, and that gave us a lot of ability to start to make different things. So here's a couple of examples of what had gone before the Industrial Revolution occurred. So if you think about the technology that was out there, of course, the mill, the water mill, was very, very important. So at the time when we talked about making food, so of course farmers grow food, corn, wheat, barley, all of the different grains. So, and of course, once those grains get dried out and so forth, we needed a way to turn those into flour. So, I mean, it's great at the summertime when we can eat the fresh food, but remember, at that point, we still need to grow enough during the summers on our farms, on the family farms, to basically provide us with all of the food source that will help sustain us through the winter months when we do not have and aren't, when our fruits and vegetables are not as readily available. So in order to do that, we needed mills, grist mills especially. So here's a couple of examples of the grist mill, or the old mill down in Pigeon Forge. I like to use the reference here in Central Illinois of going over to Lincoln's New Salem State Park, which is close to Petersburg, Illinois, where there's an example of a water mill there that was turned into and was used for both being a grist mill and a wood mill, or a lumber mill as well. So, and of course, there's also a mill that was built there up off of the river down in New Salem State Park that used oxen to drive that and to basically provide the gearing. So those were important buildings that came about, that areas needed, towns needed, in order to be able to convert the crop that they were growing into usable flour to sustain them through the long winter months. So if you think again about clothing here, we've got this idea of a carding mill. So here you see the carding mill there at Lincoln's New Salem State Park. This particular carding mill, in the back, there was a big wheel. Oxen would be hooked up and attached to that wheel, where they would drive that wheel all day long. That had a long shaft that came up here with different types of wooden gearing systems that would also then drive the equipment that was inside the mill that was used to more or less pull and separate wool in order to get the fibers and make clothing with.